I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm sorry I won't be able to spend more time this year. Jack, this is our number six. In aggregate, how many have we had the pleasure of working with? It's close to 300? Yeah, close to 300. So imagine people like yourselves over the last 6 years sitting here in this room talking about civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, creating their own circle of interest and sharing this information with people, and they in turn share with others, and you create a network of knowledge and information that ends up being, in aggregate, quite significant. What I wanted to just mention something to Jim and Mary is that if you were a child of the '60s, I was graduated from college the same year that Bill Clinton did, and that was 1968 was an absolutely seminal year in our country. And I just wanted to point out to Jim is that everybody believes that the big turning point riot was in Columbia during that year. And he's looking back, he remembers, and so does Mary, but it wasn't. It was at Colgate, because at Colgate, which was then an all-male school, 60% of the student body, 65, basically sat down in the president's office. And a third of the faculty to 40% of the faculty refused to conduct business. And this was over a racial incident. Oh, there we go. This was over a racial incident that just sparked a set of events that were in coordination with what was going on in the rest of the country. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed. Robert Kennedy was killed. We were in Vietnam, which was a source of chagrin for a lot of people. And it was a fulcrum and a turning point. But I wanted to spend time with you today talking about the origins of ICNC intellectually, and then talk about the future of civil resistance in my own mind in terms of how it's going to be, these ideas are going to be more impactful in the future. And so basically, what are the things you're going to discover in your lives, because you're all young and lots of stuff is going to happen to you, is that the greatest things that happen to you are the ones you don't plan on, the ones you don't foresee. And the question is, do you have the intuition to realize that this is an important thing to do, and then to take it in the direction it wants to go? So things start in very, very small packages. I was a student here at the Fletcher School, and I took a course with a man named Tom Schelling. Tom Schelling was, during the Cold War, the premier theoretician about how to communicate between the Soviets and the Americans based on both of them being in possession of nuclear weapons. How to create a level of communication that really reduced the risk of war based on misunderstanding. And I took his course called Strategy, Coalition, and Conflict, and I think the older people here would know that that was a course, and the books he's written were, the Bibles of strategic studies. And I came up to him one day, very much like people of my age, and said, I'm very interested in the subject of asymmetrical warfare. Why is it that sometimes the people with less military capability beat the people with more military capability? Now, I was interested in Sir Basil Liddell Hart and his concepts of indirect war, the psychological and economic and non-military elements. And he said, I think he was sort of like a throwaway for him. It was sort of amazing. And he said, if you're interested in why people sitting with inferior military capability can win, why don't you study what happens when people have no military capability whatsoever and see why they win? And I have this guy I want you to introduce you to down the road who's at the Center for International Affairs, and his name is Gene Sharp. So I went by to say hello to Gene Sharp, and he turned out to be my thesis advisor, with another gentleman here named Bob Falsgraf, who, by the way, still teaches here. He taught my son here. I think the gentleman's ageless. And I wrote my dissertation called Strategic Aspects of Nonviolent Resistance Movements. And what I did is I compared two events. One is the Indian independence movement, and particularly the Salt March, which was a highly planned, thought through, carefully led movement, to the first Russian Revolution in 1905, which was a spontaneous eruption that traveled like wildfire, that had no real leaders and had no strategy. And it was interesting to me that the Indian movement had much more power at the end, because ultimately what happened to the movement in Russia is that it was co-opted by the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and turned into a bunch of street brawls in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and basically died out. So I want to understand why the contrast, why that happened. They both were basically civilian-based. And what I came to conclude is that the thing that mattered most in these conflicts is who had the most skill, not who had the most oppressive regime. As a matter of fact, you can make the argument the more skillful opponent of the two was Lord Irwin, and the British Raj was the more skillful and difficult opponent to beat than actually the Tsar, who was completely back on his heels. So it seemed to me that the opponent wasn't as important as the skills and the thoughtfulness, the planning, the conscious activity of, these are irritating, aren't they? Let me apologize. Usually what I do is I just take my shoe and I beat them to death, but here we go. But to me, it was the skills that were more important. And that simple idea stayed with me. Now, what happened to me was, to sort of date me, is that when I wrote the second longest doctoral thesis in the history of the Fletcher School, and in those days when you wrote your theses, it was typed with carbon paper. Does anybody know what carbon paper is? You're dating or something. And so basically, I went broke paying my typist, because it just was unwieldy, and I had her, she had me over a barrel, to say the least. So because I was broke, I did my thesis. I went into banking, and I got unbroke there. And then I always wanted to take that idea that civil resistance, nonviolent conflict, was really driven by the skills of the resistor rather than the conditions in which they found themselves in, and refine it with more cases. I, very much like a graduate student, I had a thesis that had 70 variables to determine success or failure, and 45 sub-variables. It was completely unwieldy. And I wanted to turn it into a book that was much tighter, that basically went to what I thought the key variables were. And 18 years later, I did that. I went to the International Institute for Strategic Studies and turned my doctoral dissertation to a book that I co-authored with Chris Krugler. And I turned those 70 plus 45 variables into 12. Today, I'll tell you, it's now, I published that in 1994. It's now, 17 years since then, and I'm now pretty well down to 3. So I've gone from hundreds down to 12 down to 3. But the point was, in every one of these cases, and in the book I wrote, Strategic Nonviolent Conflict, which, by the way, Gene Sharp and Tom Schelling forwarded, the basic idea was that really what drives these conflicts at the end of the day, what determines success and failure, is the skills of those who resist, not the conditions in which they find themselves in. Because at the end of the day, skills, and this is the important idea here, skills drive conditions, not the reverse. Conditions don't make skills. Skills drive conditions. Now, that book, as I like to tell people, and my colleagues at ICNC have heard this a zillion times, basically printed 5,000 copies, and I had to give 2,000 away to sell the book out. And I'd give it to my old banking friends, and I'd ask them what they think, and they basically would say, well, it's awfully abstract, or they'd say it's sitting on my night table right below my John le Carré novel, meaning never speak to me about this subject again. And I was sort of devastated, because I'd really said what I thought was the important thing to say, and I thought it was over. And then what happened is Steve York came by, and he said, I read your book. And I said, oh, that's interesting. That means you're sort of an endangered species here. And he said, no, I could turn this into a movie. And so I said, leave me alone. And so he bothered me for about 6 months. And finally I said to him, okay, if you could do through a movie what I really have made no impression on anybody through a book, which is to show that even though these events, because there's going to be a series of stories, a force more powerful, happen at different times in different places, they're essentially the same story. The story about how acts that are not violent but highly disruptive can, for a variety of reasons, undermine the legitimacy of an authoritarian. And by the way, when I use the term authoritarian, that's shorthand for any form of oppression, because there's lots of other forms of oppression other than authoritarian. There's corruption that oppresses, there's ethnic violence. And so when I use that term, I want you to understand, I know in our discussions today, discussions for the rest of the week, people here are not necessarily dealing with authoritarian rule per se in the classic sense of Mugabe or Lukashenko or Bin Ali or whoever you may think of, but there are other oppressive issues, and so I want to be recognizing of them as well, and a lot of what I say I think totally applies there as well. So I wanted to, so I said, Steve, if you could do that, I'm in. So we went to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and they made a really interesting deal with me, and they said, Peter, we'll give you $40,000 as to show we're interested, and we'll help you, give you credibility to go on public broadcasting, to get on public broadcasting. But if you don't get on public broadcasting, I want the $40,000 back. So I said, okay, and they were very, very helpful. We got on public broadcasting, and A Force More Powerful was created by Steve, and instead of having to plead to distribute 5,000 books, 3 million people saw that. And then we went to visit with this ne'er-do-well up here and a bunch of others like him in Serbia, because 1 month after we showed the movie, this is the point about taking an idea where it leads you and not having any fear about doing it. And 1 month later, after we showed A Force More Powerful on public broadcasting in the United States, Milosevic announced that he had to step down to spend more time with his grandchildren. His grandson, I think it was, right? His grandson. And we're saying, well, wait a second here. Every member of the foreign policy establishment, and I'm part of it, I'm on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, would tell you there was no way that man was leaving office except in a blaze of gunfire. Bill Cohn, Madeleine Albright, they'd all tell you the same. Why did it happen? So what happened is we went out and showed them, Steve and I came, I think it was Steve, not me. Steve came armed with A Force More Powerful and showed them the Chile story of how Pinochet felt. And Yvonne and others said, well, geez, if we had seen this story 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we would have known what to do. Skills. Known what to do. Known what to do. And we then made a movie on why Milosevic fell. Interesting story. Totally counter to predictions. Another interesting theme here is in every situation, in every case that I've been part of in this history since early 1970s of civil resistance, the regional expert in that area would have told you no more than a month earlier that it would never happen here. And why do they tell you that? Because in their minds, the only thing that matters, the thing that makes them have currency in their profession is that they know all the players at the top. So all the players at the top sitting here talking to each other, but what happens underneath, they're not watching. This happens time and time and time again. And it sure is happening in the Arab Spring. More about that in a minute. So we went and did a movie called Bringing Down a Dictator. Millions saw that in the United States. And then we start to translate these. And then something remarkable, translate these and show them around the world. Something remarkable happened that nobody expected, is that people start to come back to us and said, look, we want to do in our own country or in our own situation what we saw these people do in the movies. And then what they would say is, but you got to understand, our situation is completely different. No bearing on this movie. So you wonder, and you sit here quietly, because you want to be welcoming, and say, well, wait a second, you want to do what they did, but this has no relevance to you. And so what they were really reconciling in their own mind was, can it be possible that the principles that we saw, the fundamental dynamics that were underlying this movie, because if you know Steve, he believes stories make movies, and so he's not here feeding you, didactic conclusions about what you have to think. They're stories. But in those stories, people see and sense a dynamic, and maybe that dynamic they're basically saying applies to them. So our job was to say back, look, of course your situation is different. Of course you have a different demography, a different geography, a different set of ethnic people, different clerical class, different bureaucracy, different economic system, and a different military and security services. Of course it's different. But if we look at these movies, if we look at history of these movements and try to find the common elements and reverse engineer them back into your situation in terms that you can digest and make sense to you, then maybe we could get something accomplished here. And we had enough requests that we decided to create the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And the point was first to deal with dissidents. But if you really think about it, we're in the business of sharing information about civil resistance, its power, its potential, and how it can best be used in a variety of circumstances. So then you start to say, well, if we're in the business of sharing ideas, we can't just be sharing ideas at the point where the conflict exists. It's almost too late then, or not too late, but you really would rather have people who are in the middle of this conflict would never have to come to you because they already have the knowledge, because the knowledge is out in the world and available. So we said, well, there's other constituencies then. Well, one constituency is academia. Because today, when you talk about conflict, then, and still now, but less so, you talk about conflict, to them, the conflict is only defined at the point of violence. It's not defined as irreconcilable interests in which power can be played out and can be used in different ways. They really have not imbibed the idea that there may be a force more powerful than violent insurrection. Where's Erica? There. Erica and Maria Stephan, I think one of our proudest moments in supporting academic work and to ingest these ideas into academia, which Maciej is doing a fantastic job with us, is what Erica's work has been in terms of making it clear that statistically, when you think about violent insurrection versus nonviolent insurrection, there's probabilities you can assess, and the probabilities of success for violent insurrection are about half as much as they are for nonviolent insurrection. There's reasons for it. Have you spoken yet? Tomorrow. Listen carefully. But so there's one constituency. Another constituency is the media, who basically their attitude. Hi, Stephen. I didn't see you before. Their attitude is if it doesn't bleed, we don't write about it. And so our job is to basically make people understand that there's a dynamic that's going on here that's as powerful as the dynamic or the model in their own head. Now that's very difficult to do. Al is here, and I think we've had a great relationship with him, and trying to basically work with that constituency. Another constituency, which is very, very difficult, is the think tank community, which I work because there's an infinitely large think tank community in Washington, D.C. And slowly, people are beginning to understand that this is a separate way, civil resistance is a separate way to look at conflict. And the last part is working with governments, which is really, the think tanks are feeders to governments, so it's sort of the same thing. But governments are, in generally, particularly ours, is very hidebound. Less so now than before, but they have a whole different set of interests and concerns. But for example, Mike McFaul, who came from Stanford, and by the way, it's a network. Mike McFaul came from Stanford. Our group speaks at Stanford, collects 30 dissidents like this group around the world every year, and they allow us to have a day to present. Mike McFaul and Larry Diamond headed that group. Mike McFaul went into the Obama administration. I think a lot of the best work that the Obama administration did, to the extent you feel they did, in dealing with the Arab Spring or dealing with the Iranians, came because Mike knew what to look for. Mike was with us at Oxford when we created the seminar on civil resistance and power politics that led to a great book that came out, edited by Adam Roberts and Timothy Garton-Ash. So all these constituencies are in play with us. And then once you think of the constituencies, the next thing you need to think about is, well, what are the media in which you communicate? And what we have increasingly come to the conclusion is that the social media, digital media has a tremendous multiplying effect. And so we had, at the start, did a lot of workshop gatherings. And we ultimately came to the conclusion that it wasn't as efficient as making sure our tools were excellent and were disseminated digitally through the internet. But this is the exception, and I don't think we'll ever change, where we want to gather a lot of people. And Al, we're going to have one, when is our next? Or we just had, when is your next conclave?
We hope next March.
Next March,
we
yeah.
just did one last month.
Right, and how many people came? So
80.
80. That's great. So that's what we're about. Now, what are the tools? Well, obviously, if you beg to get 5,000 people to read a book, but many tens of millions now have seen the movies, it tells you that the visual is very, very powerful. So we use the visual to back into academic work, books, monographs, and so the visual. We want to get the academic work with Steve and others to be as good as it possibly can, and with Erica. And then the next thing we tried to do is to try to make the didactic part, the part where you're trying to communicate and tell us, and not tell a story, but to make a point, to make that as in the kinds of portions that young people really want. So, for example, we can do a documentary on 90 minutes, but we could also do a YouTube video for 10 minutes, which is, have they seen First Look yet, or they will, or? Well, you see, we produced this thing called, do they know about it, Nicola? Has this group seen First Look yet, or?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, we'll give you one, but we've created a 12-minute video of frequently asked questions about nonviolent conflict, which you can take a look at. And by the way, the problem with it now is that it was all pre-Arab Spring. But if you watch it and learn the lessons, the last question, in which I'm going to go into in a minute, is how can I win? They ask a whole series of questions about nonviolent struggle, which is typical of what people will ask. And the last question is, how can I win? And some of the predictions about, some of the points about how the key thing here is to basically undermine the loyalty of the military. If you realize that we produced this a year and a half to 2 years ago, it basically speaks volumes about, predictive volumes about what happened in Egypt. Okay, so that's what we're about. The last element here, which I think is the most important, that I worked with Yvonne on, is the game of civil resistance. We've now gone through 2 iterations. It's been fantastically expensive to get it done, and I believe that the game, where you can actually create a model of your own circumstances with all the variables associated with your adversary and your capabilities and your geography and demography, all the things that go into what a conflict is, you're going to be able to lay those out in the game and then take decisions. I decide to do this, I decide to do that, and then you get some feedback, and as you get feedback, you can adjust. And this bleeds into to the point I want to make about now the future of civil resistance. The future of civil resistance is in the international knowledge about how to refine the skills of what makes a civil resistance successful. Because in every conflict going forward, in every place where there's oppression, you have conditions. You have a nasty leader, you've got maybe a society that's cowed, you've got corruption that has a certain quality or structure to it, or lack of structure to it. But in every case, there's conditions. What needs to be understood is, well, how do you counter those conditions? What determines a skillful decision being made or not a skillful decision being made? Let me do it by analogy. In a recent book, I think it was by Malcolm Gladwell, he talked about the #1 chess player in the world today is the youngest chess player ever. And how did he become a great chess player? Well, he played computer chess from a very early age, nonstop. And what he would tell, and what that computer chess taught him was that he could learn, he experienced through computer chess an accelerated course in how to lose in every possible way to lose. And he would say, when he competed, that now when he's in the middle of a competition and he makes a move, sometimes he feels what he calls heat. This intuition that he was there before and it didn't work out really well. And so he could adjust. And so the game is a safe place for people living under highly risky circumstances to gain confidence about what will work or what won't work. And so I want to talk a little bit about this and then I'll stop. I want to compare civil resistance and violent insurrection. And both have a common view of the battlefield, that there's a leadership. Now again, I'm just speaking about authoritarian rule. There, you can recreate this model in different ways, dealing with your own circumstances. But here's one exercise. So you have a leadership at the top. You have an elite that does the bidding of the leadership. They are given preference in terms of their economics, their status in life. They're there to they're there because in one respect or another, the leadership has bought them and has differentiated their status with the other pillars. These elites control the religious and ethnic pillars, the cultural pillars, the economic and bureaucratic and security. And then these pillars of support basically translate down into the general population, and that's how a population is led. In a violent insurrection, what you see is guerrilla forces insert themselves between the general population and those pillars. Their job is to attack the pillars. Their concept is, let me attack these pillars, let me kill as many people as I can inside these pillars to make these pillars fall, then attack the elite, then the elite attacks then we can kill the leadership and we're home free. Now there's two problems with that. The first one, not to steal thunder from Erica, but the probability of success historically has been what, 27%? Is that it? Yeah, 27%. And so what happens? The reason why the probabilities are low is because the pillars, now threatened, move closer to the elites move closer to the leadership. The leadership then counterattacks with their own military and security forces. They usually have superior power. The guerrilla forces are killed, and there's tremendous collateral damage to the population. Any questions about that? Now, it's a very gross model, but it's not that. It's a reasonable approximation of what the facts are. Now, let's look at a civil resistance movement. The premise of a civil resistance movement is based on what Natan Sharansky calls latent double thinkers. That within each pillar, there are people who don't want to be there, who are unhappy with the system, who, however, are scared to death about emerging because they think if they emerge individually, their heads will be cut off and they'll have no chance to basically express themselves. It'll be a pointless exercise. So strikes, boycotts, mass protests, all of that is an externality that they could relate to give them a sense that maybe they're not alone. Maybe there's ways that they can link up to the dissent in ways that basically are lower risk. Now let me make 2 points here that you're going to hear time and time again. Civil resistance is not nonviolent protest. It's much more than nonviolent protest. Gene Sharp's going to speak tomorrow, and I'll be here tomorrow for that. We'll tell you that there's he'll claim there's 198 methods, but really there's an infinite number of tactics you can use in civil resistance. I like to use a Schelling formulation to talk about dividing them into two piles. The first pile are tactics that you use where you are doing something your opponent might want you to stop doing. Okay? So the second pool are tactics that you're stopping to do something, stop not doing something your opponent wants you to continue doing. So what would be a case of the first? A protest in the street would be something that your opponent would want you to stop doing. A strike would be something that he would want you to stop doing something he'd want you to continue doing, because in all movements, it's a battle between the few dominating the many, even in corruption and everything else. And so the problem that the opponent has, as opposed to a violent insurrection, there's just one response: to destroy and kill the violent insurrectors, which are a rather small group of people. The problem that you have in a civil resistance movement is that your opponent not has to win, but also has to re-co-opt your cooperation. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. So the premise here is that if we can discover where the latent double thinkers are and use tactics to make it less risky for them to come out and to participate. And I also would tell you that different tactics have different levels of risk for different people. So a protest of a finite number of people has a bigger risk than a protest with many, many more people. It has a bigger risk the more times you do it. So for example, if you see in Iran, the later protests were more risky than the earlier ones because in the earlier ones, the Iranian government was back on its heels. They didn't know how to respond. As they adjusted, the later protests became much more risky than the earlier ones, and that's why they ultimately burned out. But a strike can be much less risky for those strikers. But on the other hand, a strike basically shuts down economic activity, which creates a negative in that respect. So the costs, the risks, these are all things that have to be carefully assessed. Now, if the splits come large, become deep enough and effective enough, at some point when the leadership tries to counter and get control via the use of their security services and military services, at some point those services split, and ultimately what happens in so many of these cases is that the military no longer obeys the leadership, and the leadership basically has no place to go. And that's why Milosevic decided to spend more time with his son, because he really understood at the end of the day he wasn't going to be able to control the military. So let's go back to Tom Schelling. Now, Tom Schelling, 50 years ago almost, made the following point. It's sort of amazing what he said. The tyrant and his subjects are in somewhat symmetrical positions. They can deny him most of what he wants. They can, that is, if they have the disciplined organization to refuse collaboration. And he could deny them just about everything they want. He can deny it by using the force at his command. They can confront him with chaos, starvation, idleness, and social breakdown, but he confronts them with the same thing. And indeed, most of what they deny him, they deny themselves. It is a bargaining situation in which either side, if adequately disciplined and organized, can deny most of what the other wants, and it remains to see who wins. This is the kernel of what ICNC is about. It remains to see who wins. The experts will tell you, you can't win here. You must lose here. The conditions are not ripe. You hear this all the time. That's not what he's saying here. It's the most adequately disciplined and organized that determine who wins. And that, I think, history has proven to be true. So, when we talk about conflict, whether it's violent conflict or nonviolent conflict, we start with the idea that there are irreconcilable interests and that we have to punish the other side in a variety of ways. In a violent conflict, you punish by trying to kill people. In a nonviolent conflict, you punish your opponent by basically undermining his legitimacy. So, in every one of conflicts, you have levels of decision making. At the grand strategic level, or the policy level, you have to decide what your goals are. You have to get the widest possible buy-in to those goals. You have to unify around those goals. You have to pick a leadership that basically can issue orders and people respond. So the key for you in a nonviolent resistance movement is to unify around those concepts and around that organization. The key for an authoritarian, or that's shorthand again for whoever is the oppressor, is to basically co-opt the elements of unity, the people who are unified, and to keep them split. Milosevic was a master at this during the 90s, right? And we have Steve has this tremendous scene in Bringing Down a Dictator in which the 14 opposition groups are trying to unfurl an Otpor flag because Otpor was trying to force them to unify. And as they tried to unfurl it, one side would constantly unfurl it, and the thing was spinning around and could never open up. And it was sort of symbolic of the fact that they could never unify until the end of the 90s. Now, at the tactical level, you want to have disruptive acts of commission, the ones I described, doing things that the other side wants you to stop doing, or omission, stopping doing things the other side wants you to continue doing. And the key to the tactical element here is to make sure you gather all the resources available to you. You have your maximum diversity of tactics available because that's what reduces your risk. And you have the ability to use these tactics in any sequence that you decide. The authoritarian, the other side, is seeking to suppress your room to use these tactics via violent acts directly of repression or threats of terror. And the threats can be even more important than the violent acts. In fact, if they're doing their job, they want to get more done with threats than with the actual use of violence. I'll get into that in a second. Now then there's, and I add this here, the logistical part, which is the capacity building, offensive, defensive. Offensive capacity building is the ability to go to a place, to have a strike, to go to a place, to communicate, to basically organize and do the things that you think will be disruptive and challenge the legitimacy of the opponent. Defensive, the opponent will counterattack with repression. So the defensive elements are lawyers, doctors, and the ability to have communications that can't be broken into by the authoritarian, and also have a certain level of mobility so that the opponent really can't catch you if you don't want to. If you look at our movie on South Africa, is that the leadership for long periods of time were well hidden. So those are the defensive logistical capabilities. And what the other side do is they want to destroy your capacity through shutdowns, tracking you, whatever it may be, to basically let them, give them the edge to know what you're going to do and to try to stop you from doing it. Now the reason I intercede this logistical element here is because there's been a lot of talk about how Facebook and Twitter and all this drive these activities. And I think people get a little bit confused because Facebook and Twitter and the like serve the purpose of expanding your logistical capability. These tools have risen in people's consciousness to such a level that they get them confused with the strategic dynamic here. And so what is the strategic dynamic? The strategic dynamic pulls everything together. The strategic decision-making pulls everything together. And so the key to your decision-making strategic capacity is your key to plan. To say, if I do this, then this will happen. But if I do this, then this will happen. And then to think several moves ahead and to basically figure out how to organize your tactics and sequence them in such a way to maximize the long-term impact on the legitimacy of your opponent. And the authoritarian on the other side has to basically have the vision to see how you're planning and try to intercept what they think you intend to do. It's at the strategic level, ultimately, that the battle is won, for you or for them. So, for example, when I told you that the British were far more difficult adversary than the Russians in 1905, it's because they were very thoughtful about how to deal with Gandhi and the Salt March. Even though they had many difficulties, they really were thinking very carefully about how Gandhi was thinking. The Tsar really was completely discombobulated and defensive, and he didn't know what to do. So when you think of the acts that you do in a nonviolent resistance movement, you have to make sure you keep them in the categories we're talking about. Don't confuse policy with strategy, strategy with tactics. Keep them separate and develop them in each individually and with thoughtfulness. So now, that's the skill. The skill is to be able to make decisions that are the most impactful. Now the question is, how do you determine what the most impactful is? How do you decide whether to have a strike or a boycott? How do you think about that? What makes a good decision versus a bad decision? So, we're going to do this a little bit graphically, and stay with me because you might not, it may be a little bit too formulaic, but you'll get a sense of what I'm trying to say. So, if you look at the upper right, we're talking about the strategy of civil resistance. At the lower left, you're talking about the authoritarian's counter-strategy. So, the key for civil resistance is to basically create the least amount of disruption for the most amount of defection. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? Your job is to create defection in those pillars of support, defection and loyalty shifts. So what you want to think about is, what tactics do I use to create the most defection for the least amount of disruption? And in the counter, what you want to do is make sure that whatever counter tactics, violent repression used by your opponent, you want to force him to use the most amount of violence to get the least amount of obedience back from you. Does everybody get that? Okay. Now, what does the authoritarian want to do? He wants to make sure that you have to create the most disruption for the least defection. He wants you to spend your resources. Remember, if you have remember what Tom Schelling said, chaos, starvation, both sides are impacted. Both sides take a hit. That's what happened in Venezuela. Is there any Venezuelans here? Okay. I remember I showed Bring Down a Dictator to a group of Venezuelan dissidents. What was it, about 5 years ago? And they said, okay, we get it. What we just need to do is just have a big general strike. And I said, well, not so fast. Who's going to benefit? Who can last longest? And they said, no, we get it. We saw what happened at the end of the movie. We want to get there right away. And so 6 weeks later, if you remember, they had this general strike before the referendum, and they basically couldn't sustain it because it was too costly to the business community. And they called me back 6 weeks, 7 weeks later, so, well, what did we do wrong? And I said, play the game. Now, we didn't have the game in as good a shape as we did now, but that's what I would say back. Here's the game. Just go on the website, think, call people who've been involved with this. But think a little bit more carefully about how you sequence your tactics. Okay, so now what does the authoritarian want? For the least amount of repression, they want the most amount of obedience, correct? Make sense? Okay. Now, there's a point where if C is working, that means that the tactics of the authoritarian have to be so repressive to get obedience that we get a crossover point to what we call backfire, where actually they get the tactics are so obnoxious to the public that they become a galvanizing factor, and basically the violence is used against the authoritarian, and it leads to more violence, leads to more defection, not to more obedience. So the point of all this is that what you want to do is you want to sequence the tactics along the AC line. In other words, constantly trying to create tactics that have low cost to you, high cost to the authoritarian. And to the extent you do that, you're going to move further and further along the line to defection. The extent the reverse happens, you'll move longer to a line to obedience, towards obedience. The line of defection is ultimately what creates victory. The line of obedience basically what leads to failure. Now, the great news about civil resistance is you could be going along the DB line, you can regroup, and you can then end up reconfiguring and going along the AC line. The reason why violent insurrection doesn't work so well is that once you're in a decline, once you're in a losing posture, you're ultimately destroyed, and there's no comeback. The beauty of a civil resistance movement, and I think, Erica, you probably can sort of capture some of this statistically, is that you can always come back. You can always regroup, because at the end of the day, they need your obedience. They want to control a society that functions for their own interest. So, at the bottom, skillful interchange by civil resistors. Disruption beats repression, that's A minus C. And repression beats disruption, that's D minus B. Now, this may be a little bit too graphic for you, but what I'm basically saying is that every time you make a decision, what is skillful is the least amount of disruption for the most amount of defection. And if you think in those terms, that's the future of civil resistance. If you develop that capacity to think and to define what skillful decision-making is in these conflicts, and to share that with others, you go a long way towards ridding this world of the worst aspects of authoritarian rule, corruption, ethnic violence, and the like. So I'll take questions now.
Thank you so much. As you have such a successful business experience combining with nonviolent movement development experience, I have such a question. What do you think is the secret of winning support of business elites? Because they're mostly interested in stability often, and any nonviolent action means non-stability.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think at the end of the day, they have to pass through this litmus test of fire, because at the end of the day, they're going to realize that in an authoritarian regime, they basically kill the consumer. So to the extent, look, it's very hard, for example, in Nigeria to make that point to extractive industries, because they just come in, they take, they pull out, and they have no interrelationship. But if business people who depend on consumers, who depend somewhat on the public, and they're living in a society that basically, and this is what happened in Egypt, I think, is they're seeing that they could do so much better if there was a regime if there was a vision of the future that was more democratic and more decentralized in power, then I think you ultimately can make that case. But make no mistake, businessmen who spend all their lives in business will protect their assets first. It's very hard. There's not many people like in the American Revolution, what's his name? John Hancock, who basically risked his entire fortune during the Revolution. Not many businessmen will do that. So you have to ultimately make the case in terms of the thing that's most important to them, which is their asset base.
In your presentation, you mentioned a lot about skills and how it's critical to win this game or to opponents. My questions are sort of like wondering that when you have a situation where majority of populations are not being skillful in terms of what needed to take next step or next action. So when you're trying to provide these skills to these populations or these people that you're working with, I'm kind of curious in terms of how do you assess, how do you determine when is the right time in terms of do we have enough skilled people, do we have enough sort of capacity for me or for anybody who's going to be organizing, like activists to launch the campaign next step. Is there any sort of formula?
There's no formula. I mean, and this is one of the reasons why we never give specific advice, in-country advice, because I couldn't, we don't know, we don't have a feel. That's something that you can only know in your own context. But you can always know how to maximize. And the way you maximize is share information, make more people understand, who buy into, who unify. The more people understand the importance of how they fit into the tactical opportunities that you have, the more people in the leadership who are determined to be strategic, not to be spontaneous and to just sort of run back and forth helter-skelter with whatever seems right at the time, but are willing to think 6 months to a year down the road or even longer. Those capacities you could always be building. Whether they're sufficient in the case, I couldn't tell you. And I certainly can't predict when these things are going to happen.
Yeah, in my very limited understanding of nonviolent conflict, what I've seen is that people power is wielded by the removal of political power, by the removal of economic power, and by the introduction of third-party influence or international pressure. And there are many regimes across the world who have resisted these three factors. So am I missing anything?
No, just that they were more successful than the resistors at a moment in time.
All right. So would you say that these three are the prime factors of people power, and there's nothing beyond that?
What do you mean factors?
Like the kind of influence people can wield on regimes. Political power, they can take that away. They can wield economic influence by crippling the economy.
No, I wouldn't. I would say, for example, in some cases, cultural influences. The loss of legitimacy at a cultural level can be even more devastating. So I think you have to look at each circumstance and say, what are the pillars of support that person has? You're correct, there will always be political and there will always be economic dimension. There'll always be a military and security services dimension, but in some cases there could be other dimensions that are equally or more important. No, I'll get you. I'll do, no, I'm sorry. Go.
How do you define defection? For instance, with defection, you mean defection of the either of the pillars or some of the elites that are unhappy with? Well, for instance, in Tahrir Square, it was fascinating to see because after about a week in the 18 days, it was obvious that the protesters were winning. Then suddenly you had Amr Moussa and you had our current prime minister. Everybody is, it's fashionable to be in Tahrir. And are those defectors ultimately? Who would you define, for instance, in the Egyptian case as being? Because I really can't think of major elites that have defected before, unless you're thinking of dissidents. Those aren't really elites. Those are sort of a different category. So
I think it's hard to define generically, but I'll give it a try. I think it's people are willing to act counter to the expectations that that are held for them in a closed society. The extent of the defection, the the impact of the defection, that's all situational. So, and sometimes, for example, if a military hesitates, that could be more significant than an ethnic group expressing their disaffection en masse. It all gets back to defection can also be defined as the impact on the legitimacy of the opponent, because it's all again situational. But ultimately, the idea of the defection is to basically make it clear that the basis in which the opponent could control you is in some respect diminished.
My question concerns multiple identities, not in a sort of mental disease type of question, but you might be, let's say, a political latent double thinker, but at the same time you belong to a religious community that's very tightly knit. Defection is not accepted, even though you think that you might like to perhaps join the resistance movement. You might also belong to an ethnic community, which is also very tight. So there is sort of a political, a private price or cost for you to leave that group and join the others. How do you break through that statement of what you might depict as the better the devil you know dilemma? In convincing the people sort of coming out of their
I think the answer is what is the vision of a different future and who's bought into it? If your friends have bought into a vision of a different future, then you're not defecting from your friends by fighting for that vision. So it starts with that grand strategic choices. What is your vision? You're trying to go from one place to another place, and the opponent is trying to stop you from going one place to another place. A big difference between what we do in the typical democracy promotion that you hear about, although the latter is very important, is that when you talk about democracy promotion, it's generally been thought of as the post-communist democracy promotion, where countries have been liberated from the Soviet Empire, and what they want to do is they want to learn best practices, the best legal practices, how to create a stock exchange, how to reduce corruption, all the accoutrement of a democratic free society they wanted to learn. So you promote democracy by sharing information. We're not at that place. We're at the place where people want more democracy, want more freedom, have a different vision, and they have somebody who's basically trying to hold them back. So we're still we're not in the place where people are talking about refining best practices of creating societal institutions. We're in the business of how do you maximize your success in a fight. And in a fight that's based on civil resistance, you have to start with the widest acceptance of a vision of something different. And so you'd have to answer your question. I have to say who's in possession of that vision, who agrees with it, who disagrees with it, then I can tell you what the dynamic would be after that.
I wanted to come back to the question of the role of the business sector, because I come from Argentina, I worked in Chile. Largely these business sectors were supportive of the corrupt and oppressive regimes because it wasn't their interest. But right now the situation is different also in other places where you have economic interests in the shape of organized crime, drug cartels, who capture the state for their own benefit. And I'm wondering then, how do you approach the business sector that profits from this situation, where the objective is not to bring down a dictator because it's largely democratic regimes, but the struggle goes elsewhere. It's to clean up the system rather than bring
One of
it
our
down.
cohorts, Shaska Byerly, has written a book on civil resistance against corruption. And I'm sorry she's not here, but we're trying to take a stab at that. But those are very, very difficult issues. What you really need to do is separate the people who profit from the corruption from those who don't, the people who are enablers from those who don't, and then put pressure on the enablers and the profiteers in ways that make them very uncomfortable. Some of it could be naming and shaming, but in other cases you actually can impact certain economic functions. For example, all of them have to go and put their money through banks, right? So there's a source, there's a node in which you can intersect with and maybe have an impact with.
In the situation in Tibet, the skills over conditions, we're sort of confused at some level over how much we work on, because we do believe skills can change conditions, but the level of repression is so high inside right now. And so the question for us is how much the skills, how much we're focusing on inside Tibet, and how much we focus on China itself as Tibetans or as the Tibet movement in terms of directing our.
I couldn't tell you how to balance that because only Tibetans would know that. But I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish. You know, people in these circumstances face real challenges, and there are really horrible conditions that they're in. But by focusing on conditions, all you're focusing on is your limitations of action. So everything is incremental. You know, and my view has always been for the last 30 years is that the more you focus on skills, the more you see ways to impact conditions in your favor. And it's like I told you, the critical thing is organize your tactical capability and then sequence your tactics. What you find is that one tactic makes the next one easier, whereas if you've tried to go the second one without the first, it wouldn't work. So you have to think sequentially. What series of things could you do that might be impactful? I don't know, but you know, what I would love for you to do is to get the game and create the Tibetan game and see what you come up with.
Couldn't you say that a lot of what we don't understand about the Arab Spring comes from collective learning, from making the wrong moves, like the chess player? I mean, Arab societies have been under authoritarian rule for so long. They have tried the losing tactics for so long. Finally, collectively, they have come up without much learning and without leadership. They have come up with a short list of what they can do as in comparison to what they can do. And wouldn't you compare that to circumstances like the Tibet? Not that I'm promoting non-learning. Learning does happen collectively.
Well, yeah, but you know, but what was it? 4 years ago, we went to the Kowloons. Was it? How long ago was it now? 4 years ago. We were at the. We were in Egypt and giving workshops, and this is what happened. Many of the people who were in those workshops were either jailed or under pressure subsequently, but at the end of the day, they were the ones who knew what to do at the critical moment. So, learning is. These movements will not succeed if you just think they're like brush fires. They sort of happen and burn up and they come out. They won't succeed. So there was an awful lot of learning that went on in Egypt. You know, I was so hardened. Mary, where were we together? You talked about, yeah, when we were in England, you talked about, yeah, in Wilton Park. You know, the story of Tunisia is a deep story going back a ways. It's not just somebody burning themselves up. Whoops, now we'll go and do it. And
lots of self-immolations.
Yeah.
The month before, months before, and a study at a general hospital had shown that 15% of admissions were young men burning themselves to death. So you can't say it's something.
And so there's lots of learning going on, and I think it's going to be learning and strategic thinking that's going to take what happens in Egypt to the end, a good end result. So, I'm sorry, Jim, you wanted to add something?
A good illustration of this is that I can outline a whole series of events in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s of the use of the sit-in tactic or marches in the United States by the black community that did not ignite anything. It was the Montgomery bus boycott that ignited a new wave of aspiration and hope. It was the sit-in campaign of Nashville that put into play a whole series of ways of going about attacking segregation at its face in the city as a whole, not piecemeal, that then created the wave of campaigns in the 60s. So the importance of skills and tactical approaches and a lot of time in strategizing and planning is critical. And everyone doesn't have to have it.
Right.
An army doesn't run on all the soldiers with the guns knowing what they're doing. The army runs on the officers who do the strategic planning. Excuse me. So, and I maintain that there's a similarity between nonviolent struggle and military violence. There are a lot of differences, but there are a whole series of similarities in terms of discovering what you can do.
Isn't the structure, the generic structure of decision making is the same? You have goals, you have tactics. In one case, your tactics are guns, and in another case, your tactics are disruptive acts. And then you have a strategy to link those tactics to your goals with a view as to what your opponent is going to do in response. Everything depends on having some view about that, some capability to exercise skills and to know what those skills are, and to distribute those skills throughout your society.
Just a quick comment on defection and a quick question on disruption. We hear the word defect or defection. We think of people who defect from the military or defect from their citizenship from one country, and these are very permanent things. But I think what you're talking about is very often seeking temporary defections. Right. If the head of a police state releases a blogger from prison under pressure, that doesn't mean he stops being a son of a bitch. You know, I mean, he doesn't go through a religious conversion. He is simply defected for that temporary moment.
Yes.
Disruption is interesting. I like this scale of the most defection with the least disruption, because a common pitfall for activists right now is they confuse disruption with change. People are so frustrated, they feel so silenced, they feel so muted, so powerless, that anything that fucks things up, you know, is seen as, oh wow, you know, we got media attention, we caused troubles, but they're not looking at, does that bring us closer to victory? And the frustration, I think, for a lot of us is, how do you get people to, instead of looking at, the goal is to say, we're here, I am, that the goal is to actually win.
Well, the key thing is to have those same people be able to define what are the impacts of what you've done, besides your sense of good feeling for self being recognized. You have to force the discussion. After this, what? I think that's the problem with some of these anti-World Bank things, is that I haven't heard, I'm not saying they should or shouldn't do what they do, but I just haven't heard from leaders, okay, now where does this go? What is your goal? Where does this go? Now, maybe I'm not listening properly, but I'm in that movement particularly, and I think I was making a point, is that there has to be, if you're going to be skillful, you have to have working assumptions about the impact, the total impact of what you're doing on your own side and on their side. Without some view, you're doing nothing. You're really accomplishing nothing.
I'm not going to be able to articulate this very well, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the challenges of nonviolent civil resistance within a working democracy like the United States. So I think there's an assumption that somehow we are the model for everyone else around the world, but what you see are actually things that we could be learning from others, or the challenges that you have in that context.
Should I do it, Jack? Should I mention? I guess I should. Yeah. The reason why I'm not here is I'm the head of something called the Americans Elect Initiative. And its purpose is to basically create an alternative way through the internet to nominate a president and vice president. And the ticket has to be a coalition ticket. It cannot come from the same party. And that the ticket will be on the ballot in all 50 states. It's very important for you to understand that there are parts of our political system that are incredibly, let's say, dysfunctional and perhaps, I would even argue, corrupt.
Venal.
What's that?
Venal.
Well, that too. So I'll give you an example. If you, under our Constitution, you can't, how you get on the ballot, in other words, when you go into your booth to vote, how you get on the ballot is determined by each state, state by state. If you're a Democrat or Republican and you win the nomination, you're automatically on the ballot in all 50 states. But if you want to run for president, you're not a Democrat or Republican, you have to deal with each state. Now, to be charitable, you look at all 50 state laws, which we have, they're inconsistent. If you're a little less charitable, you recognize they're pretty arbitrary. And if you're totally accurate, they're premeditatively anti-competitive. So, for example, let's take your state, California. Okay? He doesn't know, I guarantee he doesn't know these numbers. How many signatures you need to get from the public to change the Constitution in California? He doesn't. It's 800,000. Okay? How many signatures do you need to get on the ballot if you're not a Democrat or Republican for president? 1.6 million. Okay? If you are a Democrat or Republican and you are running for governor, so you want to be on the state ballot, how many signatures do you need if you are a Democrat or Republican to get on the state ballot? 1.6 million, 800,000. The answer is 60. Not 60,000, 60. I could go on and on. These laws are determined to eliminate competition. What's worse is that in our society, if you read the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10 by James Madison, he basically said, look, if our political society, if our society in their politics start to organize their people who are in disagreement into parties, those parties will elevate animosities between the parties to such an extent, he said this 230 years ago, to such an extent that the two parties would rather vex each other than to get anything done. He said that 230, it sounds like today, doesn't it? And so we're in a very, very big problem in our country because until now, the issue was how big does government get? And so it was great. The two parties could stay out there, yell and scream at each other, but share goodies and stay in power by basically aggregating more and more of our economic activity to the state. Now everybody understands, without exception, the president, Republicans, that we have to downsize that because we're going to go out of business. Now we're in a very, very different exercise. It's an exercise of shared sacrifice. This system is incapable of that. And the reason it's incapable of that because the two parties can stay out there yelling and screaming at each other and there's no accountability. So in between those two parties, there's 90 million what we call homeless Americans who are socially tolerant, who are fiscally somewhat conservative, and they don't feel comfortable with what either party is doing. So you have Obama's health care law basically gets no Republicans. Republicans take control of Congress, and then they say, well, that means we should be repealing it. Well, that's not what the American people want. They wanted a health care law that 75 senators and 330 members of the House, in other words, an overall large majority sign on to, so it's a stable solution. We have the Ryan plan to basically eliminate deficits, and no Democrat signs on to it, even though there's no doubt that parts of what Ryan is going to say has to be included. And at the end of the day, the Congress can't even deliberate, so what they do is they basically say, okay, let's create a deficit commission, and basically anything you say, the Senate says anything you say in this deficit commission will do, which means nothing you say will do. So we're in a system today that's incapable of decision-making. And the reason it's incapable of decision-making is because you can have all the advocacy you want. Think of it as a huge gushing river. And at the end of the day, we have a system today where the political class is laughing because all these well-meaning advocacy ideas, and they are well-meaning, and they're plentiful. Go to D.C., there's more ideas than you need. At the end of the day, what happens is at this gushing river of ideas, it meets a fork in the road, and the fork either takes you all the way out to the right or all the way out to the left. And at the end of the day, you have to basically deal with the political class's toll road. And that's why we have primaries, and that's why we have a woman who basically, with only 30,000 votes in Delaware, basically after she wins the nomination for Senate, has to declaim the fact that she's a witch. This is in America. So what we're doing, which is not easy, is we're here to blow up the fork in the road. Because there's no doubt in this country that no party is going to dominate the other. We're going to have integrated solutions where people on both sides are going to have to come together with stable solutions. As much as we feel that we want to have it, it won't happen. And so this is a form of civil resistance against a system that basically is really hurting our country. And so the answer is, what was your question? I think I answered it though, didn't I? I answered it though. Yeah, and don't think that our country has a lot of soul searching to do about how we conduct our political affairs. And you might agree, you might prefer one side or the other, but the simple fact is 70% of Americans, you can't get away from this, 70% of Americans want an alternative to the two parties on the ballot in 2012. As we've gone around the state of California to gather addresses, we've now gathered 1.2 million signatures. And let me tell you what a signature looks like, because it's a democratic activity in the United States. You go to a mall, you go to a Walmart, they walk out and it's a poor lady with 4 bags and 2 kids in tow. Say, can we talk to you? Would you sign up for this or that? And every signature drive in the history of our country has been, sign up for this candidate. You see these all the time. Sign up for this referendum, right? In California, okay? For the first time, we're basically saying, look, would you like to have a choice? And would you like to have a voice in that choice? Now, there's a big metric in these signature drives, which is of the people that'll stop, how many will sign? And you have like 20 seconds to convert them. And the people we're working with, Arno Political Consultants, have done 600 of these, most of them in California, and their average conversion ratio is slightly over 50%. And the reason why it's over that is that when you stop somebody, you say, would you like to sign for this person or that idea? And their proclivity to sign, their reason they stopped indicates their proclivity. So it's slightly over 50% on average. The conversion ratio that we've experienced in California, and really in the other states we've been in, is over 70%. I'm told only the referendum for marijuana laws have had better conversion ratios in California. And it's telling you that there's a hunger for something else. The American people believe that their leaders are incapable of leading now. And, so you hear people say, well, the American people, they're all screwed up. They want less debt, but they want their entitlements. No, they'll hold on to the things they have until somebody who can really develop a stable solution, and they will give them up, and they'll all adjust. Everybody will adjust in a deal that everybody feels is stable and basically incorporates the best of our values. But our politics are incapable of this right now.
So would you describe that then as trying to create a new kind of political space?
Yes, what we're doing in effect is not creating a third party, we're creating a second nominating process. If you go on our website, it's called americanselect.org. You'll see it. It will be up and running. And one of the we have little ways to express ourselves. For example, we have this little saying called "the parties are over," meaning the two parties. We're trying to lay an axe root at the whole process, because the process that you see now is not the process that bears any resemblance to our Constitution. The Constitution never said anything about a Democrat or Republican. And I guarantee you that at the end of the day, you can sit the most radical person on the left with the most radical person on the right. If they're not compelled to stay out there by the system that two parties are dominated by the edges, they will come to solutions. So this is, in effect, a resistance against a duopoly. And it's born of the same ideas. What did we learn over the last 40 years? We learned that before 40 years ago, if you were living in authoritarian rule and you wanted to do something, you had two choices: either do nothing and be passive, or do something which is basically a violent insurrection. But then these ideas of civil resistance came up. It was a new tool. Its conceptualization has been refined. We've had better experiences, and what you see is a new tool creates a new organizing principle, and that organizing principle creates immense change. So I don't know, again, Erica will tell you this, but it's probably been 55 countries that have gone from authoritarian to democratic rule in the last 40 years where some tactics of civil resistance were an important part of it. It's the same thing here. The two-party system in our country has failed. And so we need a new system, a new tool, a new organizing principle, and we'll get back on track. Because you could take the best, you know, we're now in the ridiculous season that we're entering the presidential season in our country. And you believe, well, if I just get the right candidate or I just get the right issue. But the fact is, you could take this bright, shiny candidate, this wonderful man, Barack Obama, John Huntsman, it doesn't matter, whatever, Mitt Romney, it doesn't really matter, no offense. But at the end of the day, what you put them through is these two meat grinders, and at the end of the day, they look like fetid chopped beef, you know, something you wouldn't never want to eat. But they're better than that in a better system. So that's what we're trying to attack. Last one, and then I'll stop.
Since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, activists in China always have a question. If next time Tiananmen Square is occupied by protesters, the massacre will massacre happen again. My question is that, have you any cases where activists, the opposition, do something different from what they did before, to prevent the possible next massacre?
Look at South Africa and the consumer boycotts. Let me make a point that was Tiananmen a strategy or a tactic? So the issue is, how did that tactic link with other tactics? Who was thinking strategically? That was a moment in time that was dramatic, seminal, but an awful lot's going on in China now, right? And so it's the linking of tactics that create a strategy. Tiananmen was not a strategic concept, it was a tactical encounter, a very important one. I don't want to minimize it, but it needs to be understood in that context. That's why it's very important to understand when you're being, skills require understanding what kinds of decisions you're making. Are they grand strategic about your goals? Are they tactical? Are they logistical? Or are they strategic? About linking those tactics to a larger strategy.
You can have a symbolic tactic that makes a sort of witness that attracts a lot of attention, but does not either build the capacity for movement or build the, let's say, the nonviolent warfare that moves scene.
Yes.
And we have lots of those.
Yeah, and the key thing, I think you would agree, is to know the limitations of that action and that it has to evolve into something else, yeah. I have to stop. And very, very nice to meet you, and I'll see you tomorrow when Jean speaks, and it was a pleasure being with you today. Okay.